A big thank you to Jason and the team as well for giving me such an amazing opportunity to be in this role that I share with the lovely Amy. I did come from a little bit left of centre. I came from Taronga Zoo, as a lot of you know, where I worked for about a long time with small native mammals that I'm passionate about. And they've basically taught me everything I know, which is I'm passionate about the bigger themes of biodiversity. So just to reassure you as well, on the side I had worked as a bush regenerator as well, so I did have some of that understanding as well. And so as I said, they've taught me pretty much everything I know. And then in 2015, I took on a Masters by Research looking at basically how small native mammals cope and react to changes at the urban edge, where the urban environment and the bushland intersect. Okay, so today we are going to, just like the bandicoot on the first slide, we're going to dig in to the concept of biodiversity, because it's a term that we use a lot, but we often use it with a fairly narrow focus, and there's so much to it. Obviously, it is life on Earth, so it's a rather big topic. And I guess the goal of the talk is to celebrate and validate the amazing work that you guys all do. Landcare supports biodiversity at every level. Every Landcare patch matters, and even within the Landcare site, every small patch matters. So we're going to look at some of the levels that sometimes get a bit missed out of conversation when we're talking about biodiversity. And why small mammals? Apart from the fact that they've taught me everything I know just about, they often miss the spotlight. So they are small, like that tiny little feather-tailed glider there. They're small, they're brown, they're shy, they're nocturnal, and they live in the dense bushland. So as most of you know, the general community misses the fact that they're there. And a lot of our, when we're talking about conservation programs, we often will use a flagship species, and our conservation program is usually Save the, and it's usually something big. Save the koala is a popular example at the moment. So some of the little guys, often in conservation, the smaller you are, the more important you are. And some of these smaller little animals can miss out a little bit. And they're so important because they undertake really important ecosystem services. Often, as I said, in conservation, the smaller you are, sometimes the more important you are. So things like the fungi and the invertebrates that can underpin the whole system, and the small mammals are part of that. So it's a great chance to shine the spotlight on them and use them to help us learn about biodiversity. So biodiversity, just as a quick reminder, is the diversity of life on Earth. And you can look at it, you can measure it at any scale. You could pick up a handful of dirt that will be teeming with bacteria, protozoa, all sorts of life. Or you can look at it at a planetary scale and look at the carbon cycle and look at that in terms of biodiversity. So you can measure it at any scale. But most sort of by convention, we settle on these three main levels to look at biodiversity. There's the large scale of landscape or ecosystem, species diversity, and genetic diversity. Within species diversity, which is, if you look around the room, we all look slightly different, and that's genetic diversity. That's the one I'm really passionate about. It's the one that gets dropped out of conversation all the time. We tend to settle most comfortably on the level of species when we're talking about conservation. And as I said, we'll often use species to hang a conservation program on. So using a flagship species can be really, really valuable because it can give you a focal point, and it can also engage the wider community. So if you're out there saving the koalas, you tend to engage the community. Everyone wants to save a koala, so you can hang a program on that. I also just this morning thought it's actually quite a good idea on a Landcare site. You could perhaps choose your own flagship species to use in that way as community engagement. But the problem with that is that we miss so much more. We miss the levels that are smaller and we miss the levels that are bigger, and we can risk sometimes missing the bigger picture. So as I said, we're going to use our small native mammals to walk us through each of these levels. And we're going to start with the yellow-bellied glider. So all of the animals I'm going to talk about are all local species, and I've worked with all of them, very blessed to have worked with all of these species. So this is Fergus, and he was a colleague of mine. He was my colleague before Amy. And has anyone seen a yellow-bellied glider? Has anyone spotlighted one or seen one? Oh, Brian, you've seen one? Whereabouts?
Run over on the road.
Oh. Damn. But they are around, and you can see, and at the end we'll get a chance to run through this database. That's the Bionet atlas there with the species records for the yellow-bellied gliders, so they are around. So if you haven't met one yourself, let me introduce you. So they are an extraordinary species. They are innately friendly. There's a couple of species that have just got that innate, incredible sociality about them. We'll often get, at the zoo we would get yellow bellies that had been caught up in a barbed wire fence quite frequently and with horrific injuries, and our amazing vet team would save their lives, but they couldn't be re-released. They'd have torn patagiums and awful injuries, so barbed wire fences are bad news. So we would adopt them into our breeding program and use them for advocacy. And even the wild animals that came in, after a couple of weeks, they'd realise that the rattle of the kitchen meant it was dinner time. You'd open the door and you'd be wearing one on your head. They're just really friendly. And we actually at one point had David Attenborough's film crew come through, and they were having trouble filming them in the wild because they set up their platforms and enticed the colony in with food, and then the yellow bellies were actually jumping on the cameras and they couldn't actually get the footage because they were too close. So they're magic. And their tail fur, or their fur, is so soft that you can see your hand touching it, but you can't feel it. It's like a puff of warm air. It's the softest fur just about of any animal in the world, I reckon. But their claws, to enable them to get a really good grip in the bark of the trees, are razor sharp. So to have a yellow belly on your shoulder with those razor sharp claws and that really soft fur, and they've also got a really charming habit of they'll induct you into their family group by rubbing their head into your neck. So you can see Fergus there, his scent gland's not very pronounced there, but they've got a scent gland on their head, and they'll rub that into your neck. So you'll have razor sharp claws, soft fur, and you just get whole body goosebumps. So they are just an absolutely gorgeous creature. So in terms of engaging with people, they are just absolutely magic. And that's the other thing about a lot of our small native mammals. It's a shame they are so cryptic because they have superpowers. To introduce somebody to a yellow-bellied glider or a tiny feathertail glider, you develop that emotional connection, and then you can use that kind of as a conduit to talk to people. I mean, everyone in this room is engaged with nature, but not everyone is. And so you can use sometimes these flagship species as a way of engaging with people and getting that emotional connection. They are a gliding possum. They have a patagium or gliding membrane stretching from their wrist to their ankle, so they stretch out their arms and legs and their silhouette is pretty much square. And they just glide from tree to tree. They can actually glide up to about 250 metres, I believe. So yeah, quite some distance. And they use their tail as a rudder to help steer. So their resources, what do they need? They feed on a mix of things. Nectar and pollen from trees that they'll lick up, so they do help pollinate as well. Insects, and they will chew these V-shaped incisions into the bark of trees to release the sap. Other gliders use that as well as a feeding source, so they are an important species in that regard. They also need hollow logs to nest in, the tree hollow. Does anyone know how old a tree needs to be to produce a hollow large enough for a mammal like this? Spot on, yeah, about 120, something like that. So even though we've got these great new techniques these days and excellent nest boxes, and we can to some extent make hollows, which is fantastic, nothing quite replaces a big old habitat tree with those hollows. So they're an irreplaceable resource. If we lose one, it's not going to be ready again for another 120 years if we replant. So retaining is so important. We're actually supposed to be talking about landscape diversity. So how do they fit into that? Well, all of the resources that I was talking about are ephemeral in the landscape. They're dispersed. They come and go. So the diversity of the landscape is really important for them. When you go home, after you leave this talk and you're going home, have a look around you and have a look at imagine you're a yellow-bellied glider, what would you eat? What's flowering at the moment? And there's either not much, or it will be maybe one species of eucalypt perhaps, because they particularly feed on eucalypt trees. So you might have spotted gums flowering. They might be flowering over here, and then they will die down, and you might have the ironbarks up on the ridges flowering, and then they die down. And the swamp mahoganies in the valley floors flower. And they die down. And then the insect population back over here that was feeding on the spotted gums might be booming. So they'll have to cross over to that and then back over to the sap tree. So they're constantly moving around the landscape. And so they're actually an umbrella species. When it comes to designing a wildlife corridor or a habitat patch, if you can conserve a patch that yellow bellies can live in, then by default you can cover all of these other species. Now the other thing about landscape diversity is, as you can see there, that it's mainly, this is the hinterland of Lake Macquarie, and it's the valley areas that we tend to clear. And if you see where their records are, they're mainly up in the ridges, and we've cleared a lot of those valley areas. And the valleys are super important because I mentioned the swamp mahogany that they feed on, and that is one of the few trees that flowers over winter. So it carries them over winter. It's really important that they come down into the valleys to access those swamp mahoganies. So by selectively clearing one type of forest, it can cause major problems for this species. You need to conserve a whole range of different landscape types. To look into it a bit further, you can see there the biogeographic regions in Australia, and then focusing more tightly, I'm sorry that's a little bit blurred, but you can still see the landscape diversity within Lake Macquarie. And there are 123 different types of vegetation community. They're obviously fairly, well, not arbitrary, but they're the ones that are mapped. So it makes a quite nice, colourful picture. But the more of those different types of vegetation that you can conserve, then the stronger the system, because everything overlaps and everything strengthens everything else, and you get that wide range of resources that are just so important. Yeah, so that's the other point that I mentioned earlier is even at a finer scale, even within your Landcare site, you will probably have different vegetation types. And again, it's important to look at conserving all of those different systems. So that's landscape diversity. That's Dotty. So does anyone know what sort of animal a potteroo is? They're a marsupial, yep. Do you want to narrow it down, anyone? I'll show you, this is Eddie. Have a look at the back legs, they're a bit of a clue. Macropod, they're a tiny kangaroo, and they are Eddie was the absolute love of my life, so I have a very, very soft spot for potteroos. So working at Taronga, we'd spend a lot of time out in the grounds, and a lot of that time was spent helping people find their way around, because it's a bit convoluted. And so that gave you quite a good idea of why people were at the zoo, which animals they really wanted to see. So it was usually, where are the elephants? Where are the chimps? Where are sometimes the reptiles? In all my time there, all my 30 years at the zoo, no one ever came up to me and said, "Can you tell me please where the potteroos are?" So I can understand why. I mean, they're not brightly coloured, they're not, they lack razzle-dazzle. They're small, brown, hoppy jobs. But it's when you get to work with them, as I was so privileged to do, that you do get an insight into their personality, and that's where their immense charm lies. They're a bit of a hidden gem in Australia that we overlook. So they are absolutely hilarious little animals. I'm sure they have a sense of humour. They have a completely deadpan expression on their face. They can't really move their facial muscles much. So everything they do is with a bit of a deadpan expression. And this was Eddie. Excuse my shameless baby photos there. He met some fairly famous people. Yeah, he's just an absolute classic. And he came with me, again, he was raised as a contact animal to meet and greet and again engage people. So he came with me everywhere to our morning meetings, and you could always tell where he was in the room because you'd hear people laughing. He'd always be up to something. He'd often crash land. He'd try and jump up on the sofa next to you and miss, or he'd jump into your lap and crash land, or he was just absolutely the most charming, gorgeous little animal. And the other reason I've got such a soft spot for them is because of the ecosystem service that they provide. And this is a great example of when you're looking at species diversity. Of course, you can't just conserve one species in a vacuum. You need to have all of the species in the system, so again, that they're all supporting each other. And potoroos give this great example because they feed on mycorrhizal fungi. So most of you guys will know what mycorrhizal fungi is. So important for plant health. And reading some of Tim Flannery's work and his theories, Australia has been geologically very quiet over the eons compared to some other places in the world. So the theory is that a lot of the nutrients have leached out of our soils. And we also, of course, have quite a difficult climate. So the plants really in Australia particularly need this mycorrhizal fungi. It's found throughout the world, but particularly important in Australia. And if you lose it and get the wrong sort of fungi like Phytophthora in, it will actually kill patches of forest. So that, your fungi is, we completely, again, another completely underrated taxa. We forget about fungi. It's so important. The world would collapse without it.
How does the bad fungi get in?
Phytophthora was introduced to Australia, and you can carry it on your boots, so that's why hygiene is quite important if you're moving from site to site. We spray our tools with meths and things like that. So yeah, but I've read some papers that indicate that if you can maintain the native fungi, it can actually act as a bit of a barrier against Phytophthora, like same with everything. Same with if you've got a healthy patch of forest, then it will defend itself against the invasion. So the potoroos feed on the mycorrhizal fungi. So normally the fungi is microscopic, and the little tendrils get down into the interstitial spaces and take up nutrients and water from the soil that the plant can't get on its own. The only time you can see it is when it fruits, and Pam O'Sullivan kindly gave me this image of all of these truffles, and that's what it looks like when it fruits. That's the fruiting body. That's what the potoroo feeds on. So it sniffs them out, digs down, gobbles up the truffle, hops around the forest, spreading the spores in their droppings. But there's an extra delightful step with this little dung beetle. So these dung beetles are specialists, and they actually will ride around in the fur of the potoroo, wait for it to do a dropping. I like to think of them getting all excited and jumping off onto the dropping, and then they will roll it underground to complete the cycle, so the fungi's back underground again. So the potoroos, the trees, the fungi, the dung beetle, everything supports everything else, and that is why species diversity is so important, and the potoroos are kind of a flagship for that. So to me, this is what conservation's all about, is conserving all of these little parts of the puzzle so that you've got function, so that the whole system functions and supports itself. So genetic diversity, the diversity within species and what makes the individuals look slightly different to each other. It's inherited, it's part of our DNA, our genetic makeup. And only a small fraction of that genetic variation is outwardly expressed or visible. And what you can see, the differences that you see, is called the phenotype. That's, I'm sorry for those of you that have genetic backgrounds, but the phenotype is the outward expression of your genetic code. And it's genetic diversity that is the basic source of biodiversity, and it is what allows species to adapt and evolve, as we'll look at in a minute. And importantly, this is the part that's often, or actually nearly always, in fact you could probably say always, overlooked in conservation policy development. This is the bit that's always missed. So we're going to use the bush rat as an example. So does everyone know the difference between a bush rat and a black rat? It's not the colour. I shouldn't have put that one in, because that is a black rat, but they can come in all sorts of colours. So bush rat is Rattus fuscipes. They are a native rodent. They are truly integrated into the natural system, a true native animal. Whereas the black rat, of course, was introduced, follows humans around the world. They spread disease and they breed up into huge numbers, and they also are very agile climbers. So one of the other differences, black rats, agile climbers, bush rats, complete Gumbies. If they do climb, it's only sort of a fallen branch or something. They're not very agile at all. So it's the the feral black rats that will climb up into the trees and predate bird nests. Okay, bad. Bush rats don't. Bush rats spread beneficial fungi that we talked about with the potteroo and seeds. So they're good. And the other thing is that they are what we call sympatric competitors. So they are evenly matched. They're very similar size. They can look very similar. And whichever species has residency in a patch will maintain that residency. So when I was doing masters, one of the larger project was looking at eradicating black rats from a particular patch, reintroducing the bush rats to prevent the black rats just reinvading. So the bush rats, yeah, really, really great little creatures. So I was looking at these urban edge effects, and I was looking at different populations of bush rats across the Central Coast. And most of the bush rats look like these little guys over here. They've got like a Roman nose, and they've got short little ears and a fairly fine tail. Then I came across a population at Kincumber, which was just near Gosford. And that's this little guy in the corner here. And this guy had larger ears and a much more sort of slender build and a slender muzzle, and it just looked different. And I was really concerned that I was sure it was a bush rat, but I was thinking, what if it's a black rat? And then it's like, oh, gee, I wonder if they can interbreed. What's going on here? Anyway, to cut a long story short, we determined that this little guy, the Kincumber animals, were bush rats. They were definitely Rattus fuscipes. They can't interbreed with the black rats. They just looked a bit different. And so this is a brilliant example of the genetic diversity of a species across its range. So even though they were quite close to each other, there are obviously differences in the environment, that there was just a small degree of adaptation going on that was leading to the Kincumber rats just looking that little bit different. And also the fact that they were just an isolated population. So the urban landscape, it was cutting those two populations off from each other. So it's these little differences across the range of a species that is so vitally important. And it's the genetic diversity is the one thing that allows species to adapt and change and react to all of the changes that animals are facing at the moment. So you could really hypothetically, and I'm just plucking this out of the air, but perhaps because these little bush rats at Kincumber have got slightly larger ears, so the blood vessels are closer to the surface, you know, you could theorise that they may be able to cope with a hotter climate. It may give them an edge over the other populations. So as, you know, if the climate becomes hotter, these other bush rats might struggle a bit to survive. These guys might actually start thriving, and the species will persist because of this population, because it'll do well. It's just a hypothetical, but just, as I said, an example of the importance of maintaining genetic diversity. And each Landcare site does this, and we'll talk about that shortly.
Different species is the water rat, which you've got in Warners Bay.
So the water rat, we'll have to do a talk on native rodents at some point. So water rats are different again. So they're much bigger, and they're what we call an old world native rodent. So they're a different genus entirely. So these are actually belong to the same genus, even though they're different species, the black rat and the bush rat, whereas the water rat is a completely different genus altogether. It's native, yeah. Sometimes people see any kind of rat, like some kind of rat swimming, and think it's a water rat. Not necessarily. If you see the white tip on the end of the tail, water rat. Yeah.
I know the settlers wiped out so many of the water rats in the hunter because they were so worried about plague.
Yeah.
They actually attacked the black rats.
The water rats?
The water rats.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yep. They wiped out so many of them because they were scared that they were carrying the plague.
Yep. Yep. Yeah, as I said, that by preserving the native rodents, they do definitely help to keep the feral rodent populations under control. So if you put those three levels together, if you've got good landscape diversity and good species diversity, and you have genetic diversity because you're conserving all of these species across a wide range, then that is what supports ecosystem function. Then you have a functioning ecosystem that can start to look after itself, or that does look after itself. And it also supports those landscape processes like the carbon cycle, the water cycle. And of course, as I said, that's what allows evolution and adaptation to occur. So Landcare groups, you guys support biodiversity, of course, at all of these scales. You can see the connectivity, the red dots there are the Landcare sites across Lake Macquarie. So that's conserving a whole range of different vegetation communities, some of which are critically endangered, as you know. And it also helps to connect the landscape so that yellow-bellied gliders and other species can move around. Of course, you directly support species diversity within your site. And another interesting or really important point that I've not read anything, I don't know if anyone knows of any material about this. This is sort of a Wendy theory at the moment. I need to research it a little bit more. But one thing that I'm thinking about at the moment is our beloved national parks are only going to be, long term, they're only going to be as healthy as the landscape that they sit in. So the healthier the surrounding landscape, the more we can conserve those really important natural areas. And for example, take a white-headed pigeon that might be feeding on a diploglottis in Wabakal Nature Reserve. And once that food source finishes, of course, and it needs to go find another food source, so it will fly across and aiming maybe at the nearby wetlands. On the way, of course, it will maybe stop off in Redhead, do a few droppings, and those seeds then will fall basically on hostile ground in the urban environment. So that will be a net loss of seed and reproductive potential from a Wabakal that's lost. On the way through, they might find a tobacco tree and feed on that fruit, head over to Belmont, and then instead of pooing out the diploglottis seeds, they're going to be pooing out the tobacco. So an example of, if on the way they stop off at a lovely little Landcare site just here, then you're helping to support that whole system. Again, it's just, so the little patches are just so important. And with regards to your genetic diversity as well, not everybody has a site that is endangered ecological community. Some of them might be like a common landscape vegetation community, but every single one is unique because every single site has got a completely unique history. It's got a unique geology and microclimate and everything. If you put it all together, it's like a fingerprint. So all these spotted gums are all spotted gum forests, but they've all got a slightly different vegetation community that they're part of. They're all expressed slightly differently, and they're all absolutely unique. So it's that idea of conserving things right across their whole range, up and down the eastern coast of Australia. And it also will support mobility, again, as the climate shifts, as all the other threats. It gives species some mobility to be able to move around and find patches where they're going to thrive. So yeah, your patch is absolutely unique. And that's the end. I have just realised that I should have said at the beginning as well that I've been mainly focusing on Landcare groups because that's my job, but the same goes for the wonderful nursery volunteers that are growing the plants that are supporting the Landcare groups. So anything that you're doing in this regard, or if you don't have a Landcare group and it's in your own garden and you've planted a native tree, that's all part of it as well.